Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, the fastest growing television station in the Arab world in the Arabic language. Kalima Horra means free word, and that's central to the discussion that we're going to have during this show. How free are words? How free should words be? What are the limits to freedom of speech? And we know that there are obvious limits, but just where should they be drawn, and by whom? In the horrific act of mass murder across two sites in Paris, in the Charlie Hebdo affair, there was a lot of blood spilt. That blood was spilt because of ink that had been utilized by cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo, a notorious, racist, Islamophobic rag, which, hiding behind the rubric of free speech, insulted in the most pornographic and obscene ways the Prophet Muhammad and many other prophets and many other religious leaders, although they undoubtedly specialized in attacking the most marginalized, the most vulnerable sections of French society. They attacked black people with monotonous and ugly regularity. They attacked even the girls in Nigeria who'd been subject to mass kidnap of 500 girls. They portrayed them as welfare queens with pregnant bellies, asking when their child benefits might be paid to them. It is a disgusting publication and about to be published in English, and it has sold, in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo affair, millions and millions of copies around the world. Out of all proportion, a different order of magnitude to the number of sales it had before. It was selling 40,000 copies per edition. This current post-murder edition has been published at least 10 million times. So we'll be discussing just what led to what was, I want to make this crystal clear at the beginning, an utterly abhorrent act of mass murder by three terrorists. It involved the murder of cartoonists, journalists, office workers, and even visitors to the Charlie Hebdo office in Paris. It involved the murder of two police officers who were guarding the cartoonists' nest inside. One of those police officers was a Muslim, Ahmed, although the hashtag Je suis Ahmed didn't travel quite so far in the world as Je suis Charlie. Almost simultaneously, a third terrorist attacked a Jewish supermarket elsewhere in Paris and proceeded to murder in cold blood Jewish shoppers, shop workers, and hold hostage many others. But most of the people who were in the shop were rescued, led to freedom by another Muslim from Mali, who has been afforded French citizenship and heroic status, I'm glad to say. By his actions, he recovered the honor of the Muslim people in France. Let me be crystal clear about my stance. Nobody should be harmed, let alone killed, for anything that they say, write, or draw. That is not to say that I in any way support or endorse the right of cartoonists and journalists to so grievously insult with pornographic and obscene imagery, which are misnamed as cartoons, misnamed as depictions of the Prophet. They were not depictions of the Prophet. They were obscene, pornographic hate posters that Charlie Hebdo specialized in. So what do we do about this? The first thing we do is we reject violence and crime of any kind. We name for what they are the people who deal out violence and crime as terrorists and criminals, which is what they are. That, I hope, should be a given. I am unaware of any Muslim anywhere who agrees with the cold-blooded murder that was carried out in Paris by these two terrorists. But I'm equally aware that the 1.6 or 1.7 billion Muslims in the world are boiling mad at the depictions of the Prophet that this magazine and others now, especially now, have carried in their publications around the world. So, at the very least, this is a combustible and dangerous situation. I believe in free words. Otherwise, this show wouldn't be called Kalima Horra. But I don't believe that any words have unlimited freedom. And in a way, that's obvious. If I defamed any of you right now, libeled you in speech, and a libel is something which is not true and which is likely to reduce, diminish, disparage you in the eyes of others, I would be sued for it, and rightly so. And I would pay a very high price if that libel, if that defamation were to be upheld in court. So that's the first limit that exists on freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But there are other limits. I am not free, not that I ever would, to incite hatred against any group of people because of attributes or affiliations they have about which they have no control. For example, here in London, I may not speak against black people or Jewish people or homosexual people or disabled people in a way that is likely to incite you to hate them. That's illegal, and for which I would rightly be prosecuted. So that's a second limit on freedom of speech. And there have been many, many prosecutions for exactly that, and even more calls for prosecution, a point to which I shall return later. But there are other obvious limits on free speech. The analogy I always give is I'm free to say the words, "There's a fire." I'm free to say them out in the street, but I'm not free to say them in this studio if the likely result is that you all panic and stampede for the exit, in which case someone might very well be hurt. So the right of a man to shout, "There is a fire," in a crowded cinema is very severely restricted by the common sense parameter that those freely spoken words will have consequences for others that could, in the extreme case, prejudice their very right to life. So we're going to explore in the course of this program on Kalima Horra, on Mayadeen television, the events in Paris, what led up to them, what happened afterwards, and what limits there should be on freedom of expression, on freedom of speech. And you're free to tell me exactly what you think. I'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London. And we're discussing the Charlie Hebdo affair, the mass murder in Paris by terrorists, and the limits of freedom of speech. I have assembled here a very gifted audience of professionals and gifted amateurs like myself. Let's take the first one. Yes, sir, you in the second row.
Hi there, George. My name's Ben. My question is, just how free should free speech be?
Well, like the camel, it's difficult to define, but it's easy to recognize. There has to be a balance struck between your right to freely express yourself and what the likely, predictable consequences of your expression are likely to be. Just before the break, I gave the example of the man shouting fire in a darkened cinema. I am free to say that word in the English language, but if I did so in a crowded cinema, I would rightly be prosecuted for causing danger to others. And I was a supporter in the British Parliament of a blasphemy law, a law like the incitement to racial hatred law, extended to religious communities. So that, for example, Judaism is not a race, it's a religion. But there are millions of people, in Britain 250,000 people, for whom that faith is central to their being. I don't agree that anyone has the right to dress up in a Nazi uniform and march up and down the road in Golders Green, denying the Holocaust. Because that freedom of speech is so deeply hurtful and offensive, including to survivors of that Holocaust, as to be likely to cause such injury to them, psychologically, emotionally, that it cannot be justified. This freedom of marching and parading, expressing oneself in that way, should be circumscribed. In some European countries, including France, it is illegal to deny the Holocaust, and you get sent to prison for it. I agree with that. I think it should be illegal here. It is illegal, though, already in France. So if it's illegal to deny the Holocaust in France, why is it legal to depict the Prophet Muhammad in obscene and pornographic caricatures? Because that too causes the emotional, psychological injury to a large group of people to whom the Prophet Muhammad is central to their being. But that's not illegal. That's called freedom of speech. Even on Charlie Hebdo, a journalist was sacked for caricaturing the son of the former president, maybe future President Sarkozy. He's running again. Although some of his friends have gone, he might find fundraising a little more difficult in the next election. He was sacked by Charlie Hebdo for caricaturing the son of Sarkozy, converting to Judaism, for what the cartoonists said were selfish reasons, pecuniary reasons. So some cartoons were allowed in Charlie Hebdo, but not others. You see a double standard emerging here. I voted for and campaigned for a ban on inciting racial and religious hatred. Now, there are philosophical issues there. Difficulties even. Because, of course, if you're born black or white, you had no choice in that. And so someone inciting hatred against you because of your color is not only venal, but it's utterly illogical. But you have a right to choose what religion you are. So you've made a choice to be in that religion. You haven't really, because you're actually born into it. But you could, theoretically at least, choose to leave it. So there are some philosophical differences about merging these two issues. And in the end, we failed largely in the British Parliament to agree a definition of incitement to religious hatred. But I think we should try again. I think we should say that there are some things so sacred, so central to people, that their willful distortion, caricaturing beyond parody, is so offensive and so likely to cause trouble. See, this is the second aspect to it. It's not just the hurt to Muslims by these kind of hate posters. It's the likelihood that some amongst the Muslims will react with such anger that there will be trouble in the society. And I think lawmakers should depart from the principle of trying to stop trouble in the society. And we do it in all sorts of ways. We segregate football fans in football stadia, because although everybody theoretically has the right to stand or sit where they like in a football stadium, we know that trouble is likely to come if Rangers and Celtic supporters, especially Rangers and Celtic supporters, are together, seated, intermingled in a stadium. So, for both of these reasons, on the issue of incitement to religious hatred, I believe that we, as legislators, should try again. What is the role of a caricaturist, a satirist, a journalist? The honorable, ethical role of such people is to hold the powerful and the rich to account, not to add another lash to the back of people who are already marginalized, already having a hard time. It's hard to be a Muslim in France. It's hard to be a Muslim in Britain, but it's harder in France. Already, without this being overlaid on top. And I don't see how any honest, ethical, moral journalist or cartoonist would see their role as adding to the problems, adding to the burdens that minorities already face. I hope that deals with your question. Who wants to ask the second question? Yes, sir, at the front.
Good afternoon, Mr. Galloway. I'm sure I speak on behalf of every sincere citizen of any Arab background when I thank you for your very noble efforts in a very noble cause. La shukra ala wajib. Greetings aside, I'd like to get to the very serious incidents which were carried out by non-Muslims in the city of Paris not too long ago. We've witnessed a massive surge in Islamophobic sentiment across the European spectrum. There's an issue which has received minimal, at most, coverage in the mainstream media, and it's one which discusses the root cause and what gave uprising to those extremist elements, because it is a truth to suggest or to say that those people do not represent Islam, and 1.7 billion Muslims across the road would agree with me. In fact, it wasn't Islam which gave those extremists a chance and a motivation to do what they're doing, but yet it was 2 years ago that the French president himself and his NATO friends were telling us that such people were secular rebels fighting for justice and truth and democracy
in Libya and
in Syria and in several other countries across the Middle East. In fact, should the Islamophobic sentiment across Europe be aimed at those individuals rather than Islam itself? Because no book teaches anyone to go out and do what they're doing.
Well, thank you, first of all, for your kind words and for your very deep and profound question. Before I deal with it specifically, I'd like to make a general point. There is no doubt that the three terrorists at least three, who were involved in this series of killings in Paris, considered themselves to be Muslims. They shouted the name of God as they were committing these crimes. They were, after a checkered past of criminal and licentious behavior in earlier years, they were, to all intents and purposes, religiously observant at the time that they committed their crime. But you're absolutely correct that Islam absolutely forbids the kind of actions that they took. Did they therefore place themselves out with the religion by the actions that they took ipso facto? I have no doubt, although I don't want to seem presumptuous, of what their fate will be on the judgment day. For what they did and for what they caused to happen to other Muslims thereafter. But that's not, of course, a matter for me, but for the Almighty. The reality is that every Muslim must revere and respect Jesus. Every Muslim must revere and respect Moses. Every Muslim must respect the Torah. Every Muslim must respect the Bible. It's not possible to be a Muslim and hate Christians. It's not possible to be a Muslim and hate Jews. It's not possible to be a Muslim and carry out a murder against someone because they're a Christian or because they are a Jew. This is completely forbidden in the religion. And that's why I think on the judgment day, these people will be subject to the most condign punishment. And they have, as you indicated, triggered an even more violent and fearful future for Muslims in France than they already faced. They already faced Islamophobia from the state, from the media, and from sections of the political class, and therefore a section of the French public. Sarkozy, the aforementioned former president of France, introduced laws banning the right of Muslim women to wear what they please in public buildings, in public institutions. French women are free to wear as little as they like, but they are not free to wear as much as they like, by law. This is discrimination, legalized discrimination against religious people. The discrimination and bigotry against immigrants in general and Muslim immigrants, so-called immigrants, many of them were born in France, is legendary, notorious. And every matter has gotten worse as a result of the actions of these killers. There have been more than 100, well over 100, that's the last time I looked, more than 100 Islamophobic attacks in France since these murders. Mosques have been attacked by grenades, bombs, arson attacks with petrol. Muslim women have been attacked, Muslim men have been attacked. A Muslim man of Moroccan origin was murdered in his house by a murderer shouting against Islam, stabbed 17 times to death in front of his wife and small child, infant, baby, in fact. Of course, the murderer was promptly put into a mental health institution. It was said that it was not an Islamophobic attack, he was just crazy. Not something they ever entertained for a second in relation to the killers in the first place. It was automatically assumed that they were religiously motivated. It never occurred to anyone that they might actually be insane. But the man who murdered the Moroccan in front of his family, he was immediately assumed to be insane. So I think it's probably untrue to say that the people who carried it out were not Muslims. I would say they ceased to be Muslims when they carried out the attack. And that's a distinction that we'll come to in the next segment, because it relates also to a crime much less in scale, but every bit it's equal in horror that took place here in London with the murder of the young British drummer Lee Rigby on the streets of South London. But right after this. You're watching Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, here for the first time in London. We're discussing the Charlie Hebdo affair. It's the title of this program, Kalima Horra, means free word. And yet here we are discussing which words or drawings should not be free. We're making clear, at least I and the audience so far are making absolutely clear, that whatever anyone says, writes or draws should never be the occasion for violence, crime, still less murder, most foul. But what about the rights of religious minorities who are overwhelmingly from minority ethnic communities in countries like France and Britain, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly? What about their rights to be protected from the lash of bigotry, prejudice, and the incitement to hatred? These are the issues that we're at work on now with this audience of real experts and gifted amateurs like me. Who wants to ask the next question? Yes, madam.
Hi, George. My name's Amina Salhi, and I would just like to agree on what you said earlier about the terrorists were ceasing to be Muslims when they carried out those attacks, because it was very evident that in the media across the world, the terminology that was used by these terrorists that carried out these attacks were they were Muslim extremists. Now, by default, by being an extremist, that means that you are practicing a maximal form of that original principle. Now, this only begs one to question: how is a person who kills and slaughters people an extremist Muslim when Islam is the religion of peace? Now, that also leads me to question you, do you think that the backlash on the Islamic community after the Paris attacks were deliberately sizzled up and egged on, to say the least, by the media in order to further heighten and portray the sinister image of Islam to the world, to maybe gain support for any future invasions or interventions in Muslim countries such as the Middle East?
Well, it's a very good question, Amina. And again, before I answer it specifically, I'd make some general points. There is no doubt that there is present within the Muslim Ummah a section of people so extreme, so sectarian, so obsessed by the verity of their own tiny, narrow interpretation of Islam that they are ready to carry out horrific attacks on everybody else who doesn't have their take on the religion. That's happened even in European countries, but it's happening on a grand scale internationally. On the day that we recorded this program, yet another bomb in yet another Shiite mosque in Pakistan claimed dozens of lives and maimed dozens more. The person who carried that out did it in the name of this takfiri fanaticism. In Syria, in Iraq, even, I'm sorry to say, on a few occasions in Lebanon, such extremist actions have been carried out by people in the name of Islam, even though the people they're slaughtering are Muslims. In fact, in Syria and in Iraq, many of the people who've been slaughtered by these people were not just Muslims, they were Sunni Muslims. Sunni Muslims who didn't accept this narrow takfiri interpretation of the religion. But dealing with your specific question, it is undoubtedly true that there are people who have something to make from such atrocities. Let's deal with them. First of all, those that hate all Muslims hate Islam. And if Islam didn't exist in these countries, their hatred would be against black people and brown people generally. These racist politicians and their followers, I've lived a long life. I can tell you when there were almost no Muslims in Britain, they were carrying out exactly the same kind of propaganda and racist attack against black people from the Caribbean, former empire, colonial subjects who were asked by British governments to come here to do the jobs that needed filling, driving buses, pushing trolleys in hospitals, cleaning, and all the other jobs in the public sector mainly that badly had a labour shortage. I've seen Irish people subjected to the same kind of bigotry and racism. Indeed, my own family have been victims of that in decades gone by. So there is a class of people who hate the other. Quite often, just like in the United States, where the worst racists against blacks in the south of the United States were poor whites who only had tuppence more than the black, who had a shack just like the black family had, but the only superiority they could imagine that they had was that their face was white and the person on the other side of the track was black. There have always been such people. But along comes right-wing, chauvinistic, xenophobic parties and organizations like the EDL, like the BNP, the fascist British National Party, and even, to a slightly lesser extent, but much more successfully, parties like UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, who know that there are votes to be garnered by encouraging these kind of racist feelings amongst the society. There are also newspapers to be sold on that basis. The Daily Express, the Sun, the Daily Star, even the Daily Mail, the biggest selling newspaper in the country, sell papers by the day by splashing on their front pages anti-immigrant, which increasingly is taking the form of anti-Muslim immigrant propaganda. Even, as I've said before, where the people they're attacking aren't immigrants at all. They're every bit as British as the people who are writing the stories, and rather more British than the owners of these newspapers, who are almost always foreign tax-avoiding nationals living for tax purposes as far away from Britain as they possibly can. But there are other more surprising beneficiaries. Liberals. Who thought I'd ever say that? You see, anti-Muslim prejudice is the last respectable form of racism. I'm talking about people in Hampstead, in Islington, in fancy parts of London, with their dinner parties, who would never dream of sitting around their dinner table with their guests talking badly about black people or Jews or Catholics, but who seem to have no compunction about slandering Islam and Muslims. There's a class of professional atheists for whom atheism is a new religion, who hate Islam and by extension don't really like Muslims very much because their adherence to faith is somehow an offense to them. They're not content with just being atheists themselves. They want to proselytize for atheism. I have no problem with someone having no religious belief. I feel sorry for them, that's all. But these people have a mission, a kind of crusade to slander and traduce those who do have faith, amongst whom the Muslims are the most obvious and visible. You see, if someone is a sincerely believing Christian in Britain, or a sincerely believing Jew for the most part, though not in all cases, it's not easy to know that just by looking at them. But it is quite easy to know that someone's a believing Muslim, especially if they're a woman, especially if they're wearing a hijab, especially if they're wearing more than a hijab, a niqab, a burqa, etc. Oftentimes they fasten on men that look foreign with beards. This is, they think, a demonstration of religious faith, of religious fidelity. That's what leads to many Sikhs, for example, who are not, of course, Muslims at all, being attacked and their property attacked because they're assumed, because of their color and their beards, to be Muslims. So there's money to be made, there's votes to be garnered, and there's satisfaction in some quarters to be had from insulting and diminishing and degrading Muslims. That's why many middle-class, liberal people who would class themselves even as politically progressive were so keen to identify themselves, not with opposition to the murder at Charlie Hebdo. We're all opposed to the murder at Charlie Hebdo, but with the right of Charlie Hebdo to draw and publish the kind of things that they were publishing amongst middle-class, educated, also civilized, also liberal people in Britain. Does that deal with your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Good afternoon, Mr. Galloway. My name is Issa Edris, and I want to ask you a question on the reaction of Charlie Hebdo to the attacks. As you're probably aware, after the attacks, they released another newspaper of the Prophet. And do you think they took advantage of the rallying support of the Muslim world against these attacks, and from people like Majid Nawaz from the Quilliam Foundation, who so-called support the Muslim ideologies, but then again openly support the cartoons of Charlie Hebdo?
Well, I'll tell you what I did in my own city of Bradford, in the north of England, which has a very substantial Muslim population. I called a demonstration in the city centre to make clear what I've been doing this evening, our rejection of the actions of the terrorists and our absolute rejection of the actions of Charlie Hebdo. And that's the stand that should have been taken everywhere. Some people were scared to do so, and some people are paid to do the opposite. Most of our viewers won't know Majid Nawaz, a former terrorist, in fact, a man imprisoned for alleged acts of terrorism during the Egyptian dictatorship, the previous Egyptian dictatorship, that is to say, losing track now of the number of dictatorships. Majid Nawaz was an extremist, a real extremist. I can assure you, I have myself lived long enough to hear Majid Nawaz denouncing me from the most extreme Islamist positions. Now he's a liberal. In fact, he's a liberal parliamentary candidate. But he's a paid agent of the British state. He receives in this Quilliam Foundation, which defames, frankly, Quilliam, he receives huge sums of millions of dollars to carry out so-called anti-extremism work amongst the Muslim community, which usually boils down to being a tame Muslim testimony, to give testimony against the Muslims for the entertainment of British television shows and British politicians. This is a very tiny class of people, though. There is a paid comprador in the Muslim community in Britain, but the British state actually doesn't put enough money up to satisfy many such people, and so Majid Nawaz and one or two others are just about the length of the payroll. Muslims should not be afraid to make a stand on this. They should unequivocally condemn the crimes of the terrorists and absolutely defend their faith, their prophet, and their right not to be so severely insulted that lunatics are likely to come forward and cause havoc in the society. That's the stand I took from the first moment. It's the stand that others should have taken. Thanks. Again, an excellent question. Much more where that came from after this. Thank you. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from the first time, but not the last, I suspect, from London town, London, England, that is. We're discussing Charlie Hebdo, the fallout from the act of mass murder in France, across Europe, and here in the United Kingdom. I know that you think the United Kingdom is part of Europe, but most people in the United Kingdom don't. So I make that false dichotomy between Europe and the United Kingdom. But it's definitely spread here. We're discussing it with an audience of experts and enthusiastic amateurs. Let's take some more. Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Hi, George. My name is Ayman Daouk. Adding up to the last question, I feel today Muslims are having the worst reputation they've ever seen. Maybe it's because some people find it easier to put everyone, the whole community, in the same box. Do you think that moving forward, the future of Muslim is to have an anti-Semitic light propaganda or defense towards the public, an element of survival?
Well, I do think that there is a real threat to individual Muslims. There's a threat to Muslim property, principally mosques, but also schools. There's a threat from racist bigots conducting a backlash against what happened. But there's also a threat of encroaching legal restrictions on Muslims' right to practice their religion in the way that they choose. I mentioned earlier that in France, it is illegal for a Muslim woman to wear a hijab in certain circumstances, in certain places. This has been resisted in Britain until now, but it's not inconceivable that one of the outcomes of the forthcoming British general election would be the emergence of a government that would be under pressure to go down the French route in this. For example, one outcome of the election could be a minority conservative government led by David Cameron, but dependent upon UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, a very anti-Islamic party, pressurizing them as one of the terms of the deal that they have to take certain legislative steps to satisfy the lust of the racists to, quote-unquote, crack down on Muslims. I think there's also a danger to Muslim education in this country. We've already seen it, even in the current parliament. There was this fake outrage over a so-called Trojan horse, which involved allegedly Muslim parents becoming school governors in order to Islamicize their children's state schools. Almost certainly, the documents on which this fake plot were based were actual forgeries produced by someone with a grudge against a particular group of Muslim parents who were governors in a school in Birmingham. This led to an absolute witch hunt throughout the country against schools with substantial Muslim populations. For example, there are some schools in my constituency, and even more schools in Birmingham, in the English Midlands, where 95% or more of the students are Muslims. Inspectors would come in and report that they detected a Muslim ambience in the school, which would be like going into a school with 95% black people and complaining that you found pictures of Nelson Mandela rather than the Queen on the wall. Of course, no one would ever dream or dare to make a scandal out of that. But they did, in the so-called Trojan horse affair, do so. And now we have Muslim parents leaving school governors' positions, absenting themselves from their children's education for fear of being branded as a Muslim extremist involved in some kind of conspiracy. And Muslim students who had come to enjoy, if that's the word, come to have achieved certain things, prayer facilities, halal food guaranteed, and so on. These things are now under threat. And that could get worse. We might get the outlawing of Muslim schools in Britain. Now, there are many Muslim parents who don't want their children to go to a Muslim school. They want their children to go to a school with a religious ethos, but they want them to be a state school. But there are some Muslim parents who want their children to go to Muslim schools, just as there are Jewish parents who want their children to go to Jewish schools. And Christian, Roman Catholic especially, parents who want their children to go to a Roman Catholic school. So it would be tricky to introduce new laws that would single out Muslims as the only religious community significant in the country that was not allowed to have their own schools. So Muslims have to cling together. They have to be united. They have to be united across different sects, different trends, different politics. They have to be together and vigilant against any encroachment of the rights they already have. And above all, they have to make links with and unity with non-Muslims who are ready to defend them and who are ready to stand with them. This is why the extremist Muslim organizations in Britain, and they do exist, are so wrong. These parties, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and even more extreme organizations than them, they want to lure Muslims onto the rocks of separatism and extremism. They want to say that we have no allies. These are all kuffar. We can't vote. It's haram. We can't be involved with non-Muslims. This is madness. There are only 2 million Muslims in Britain. There are 65 million others. If the Muslims want to defend their position, they have to make friends and influence people. And they have to conduct themselves in a way that doesn't drive people away. Look, people, Ayman, have a bad impression of Muslims in Britain. And sometimes that bad impression is the fault of the Muslims. Nobody I know would allow their wife to walk up Edgware Road in the summertime because a very large number of Muslim men smoking shisha outside the cafes would make indecent remarks and propositions to them. In Edgware Road, if you go into a telephone box, you can't see out the windows for postcards in Arabic advertising prostitution and vice of all kinds. This gives a very bad impression. When one sees a Gulf sheikh cruising down big London streets in their $500,000 motor cars and behaving like beasts, the public thinks that's the Muslims. That's how the Muslims behave. Or an extremist who doesn't talk to his neighbor, doesn't develop neighborly relations with the people amongst whom he lives.
So, George, just quickly, one other question then, following on. Would you say that the Jewish community in Great Britain, which is about 300,000 and therefore about a sixth of the Muslim community, have been far more successful in making friends and influencing people?
Well, a section of the Jewish community has made very powerful friends and influenced people mightily. But generally not the religious part of the Jewish community. It's one of the big surprises to many that a huge proportion of the Jewish people, not just here, but in what they call Israel, are not religious at all. Don't follow any religious obligations, or if they do, in a very desultory way and only the most important of them. The Zionists themselves, when they asked Mr. Balfour to make his infamous declaration in favor of a so-called Jewish homeland in Palestine, every single one of the Zionist leaders sitting opposite Mr. Balfour was an atheist, a self-declared, avowed atheist. I always say the Zionists don't believe in God, they just believe that God promised them Palestine. That section of the Jewish community has mightily made friends and influenced people. And you have to take your hat off. It's been a pretty successful operation. Journalists in Britain are in terror about writing anything in their newspapers or magazines that might offend that section of the Jewish community in Britain. And usually they don't bother, because they know their finger pauses over the keyboard. They know that if they write what they want to write, they'll have to spend the next 2 weeks dealing with a shoal of complaints, allegations, insults, accusations, and so on. So generally they write about something else. But the most religious Jews live a very segregated life in places like Stamford Hill, in Hackney, in East London, live a very segregated life. And before the Muslims came, it was they who were the victims of the kind of bigotry and discrimination we're talking about now. I don't know if everybody knows that. One of my most important books that I ever read as a young man is a book called The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist, written by a man called Robert Tressel, which is set in 1901, it's written in 1901, so more than 100 years ago. And the conversation that opens the book, where the painter and decorators are all bemoaning the immigrant Jews, is identical to the kind of conversation you would find today. They say, these Jews come over here and speak their own language. They don't even speak English. They cover their women's heads. They eat different food. They smell different. All the kind of racism that you see today against Muslims in 1901 was practiced against the kind of Jews in the religious Jewish community that exists in London. But one lesson, David, that can be drawn from your question is this. If there are, what did you say, 6 times? If there are 6 times as many Muslims in Britain as there are Jews, how come the Muslims have so little power and influence? We shouldn't ask ourselves, how come these Jewish people, mainly irreligious people, how come they've got so much power and influence? A better question would be, how come you don't have any power and influence? And the answer is, surely, unity. Jewish people are very disputatious. They have many, many different trends and currents within them. If you look at the Israeli parliament, they frequently come to blows, punch each other, roll around the floor fighting. It's not that they are, in all regards, united, but on one thing they are united, and that is defense of Israel and Zionism. And they're ready to put their money where their mouth is. They're ready to pay for and organize power and influence. Well, the best answer to that is for the Muslims to do the same. But they don't. I was once taken to dinner by one of the sons, I better not name him, of the late and great Sheikh Zayed, the former ruler of the United Arab Emirates. And this prince asked me, how come the Zionist lobby is so much more powerful in Britain than our lobby? I said, Your Highness. Well, he was paying the dinner, so I had to call him Your Highness. I said, Your Highness, we don't have a lobby. What do you mean more powerful than our lobby? We have no lobby. But, I said, it was in Mayfair, of course. I said, I could take you in a 1 mile radius of this restaurant, and there are Arabs in every casino throwing more money on the roulette tables and the blackjack that would pay for 10 lobbies. We could have the most powerful lobby in the country if the people who've got the money to pay for it weren't wasting it on vice of various kinds. There'll be more of this after the break. Thank you. Welcome back to the final segment of Kalima Horra, Free Word, on Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway, in London. We're talking about the Charlie Hebdo affair and the earthquake which it has caused for Muslims across Europe and reaching across the English Channel to the United Kingdom itself, which is normally isolated from much of what happens in the European mainland. But not this, unfortunately. Now, who'd like to ask the next question? Yes, sir.
مرحبا مستر جورج، أنا أحمد القحطاني، أتكلم إعلامي في بريطانيا. حبيت أسأل عن قضية فرنسا والقضية اللي صارت في فرنسا، الإرهاب اللي صار في فرنسا. لماذا يعني قضية الإرهاب في فرنسا الصحف الفرنسية لم يعني يخلوها في محور أساسي ويكون التركيز على أنه القضية لا تحتوي شيء أكبر من هذا القبيل. فالسؤال هنا مهم، بأن القضية لماذا الفرنسيين يعبرون عن رأيهم الشخصي. أوكي صحيح، ولكن التعبير عن الرأي الشخصي بهذه الطريقة ليست صحيحة أعتقد. أنا حبيت أخذ رأيك بهذا الموضوع وأشوف بأن التعبير عن الرأي هل هو تجاوز على حقوق الآخرين أو المقدسات الآخرين؟
Well, of course, that's the big question, the 64,000 euro question. The depiction of the Prophet is forbidden to Muslims. It was not actually at the beginning of Islam, but it became a cause for concern in the Muslim Ummah, the danger of idolatry, the danger of worshipping the Prophet rather than worshipping God. And so depictions of the Prophet were forbidden. These are not depictions that we're talking about. I'm struggling with this. I'm repeating myself everywhere over and over again. In the latest edition of Charlie Hebdo, there is a cartoon, which of course, how can we know, bears no resemblance to the Prophet whatsoever. It's an invented icon which purports to be a depiction of the Prophet. If all that Charlie Hebdo had ever done was that kind of depiction, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. After all, Charlie Hebdo is not run by Muslims. The cartoonists are not Muslims. But I would not offend our audience by describing the kind of hate caricatures which Charlie Hebdo routinely published of the Prophet Muhammad. It would be too extreme. But the most extreme thing you can possibly imagine, they've done it. This is what causes the anger and the offense. And for me, it ought to be illegal. First of all, no journalist or cartoonist should want to do it. Why would you want to do it? Why would you want to do it to anybody regarded in such reverence as a prophet of any religion? Why would you want to do it? What's gained by doing it? How are you in any way fulfilling any kind of honorable employment by doing it? But if they want to, it ought to be illegal to obscenely, pornographically caricature anybody's prophet, or frankly, anybody at all. It ought to be illegal. And I'm struggling for that here. One problem is that for Christians, it is not forbidden to depict Jesus. It's not forbidden. In fact, outside every Roman Catholic church in the land, you'll see a statue of Jesus on the cross. It's not forbidden for them. So for many Christians, it's difficult for them to compute. Well, you can draw and portray our prophet, they say, our leader, Jesus Christ. So what's the big issue about depicting the Prophet Muhammad? Of course, Christians are entitled to have their rules, and Muslims are entitled to have theirs. But when it comes to obscene caricatures, it becomes like the 1930s in Germany. There was a newspaper called Der Stürmer, which specialized in exactly the same kind of obscene caricature of Jews. In fact, the facial characteristics of the Jews being caricatured in the Nazi newspaper Der Stürmer are almost identical to the obscene caricatures of Muslims in Charlie Hebdo. Nobody in their right mind now, perhaps even then, would say Der Stürmer has freedom of speech. It was regarded as with disgust then, back in the 1930s. So again, I return to this point. If it's illegal, as it should be, to do such things about Jews, why is it not illegal to do them about Muslims? That's my question. Yes, madam.
Hi, George. My name's Julia. I agree with a lot of what you've said. I just want to know, to what extent do we continue to restrict the freedom of expression rather than transform an ideology, or maybe teach young people about the fundamentals of Islam and what's right and wrong in Islam, so that when they grow up, they are not the same as this, they don't take this extremist ideology as fact?
Well, I think it's not either or. I mean, for example, in my experience amongst young people today, racism is far less prevalent than it was 30 years ago. That's partly because of the changing composition of British society. One of my own sons goes to a school which, I mean, he's only half white, but he's the only half white person in his class. Everybody else in the class is black or Asian or Arab. In fact, mainly Arab. So it would never occur to him to have racist feelings about the people in his class. His best friend is a Somalian boy called Masood. He's never once mentioned to me, and I didn't know until I met him, that Masood is black. So racism has become much less fashionable or acceptable over the decades just by that education process that you mentioned. But it's backed up by legal restrictions on racism. There has been, for 40 years in this country, laws which forbid people to act in a racist way. Doesn't stop all people behaving in that way, of course. So there are anti-racist laws, and there is a change in attitude amongst young people towards racism. And I think that is the right approach, belt and braces. We need laws, but above all, we need a change in attitudes. Gentleman in the hat at the back. I like hats.
Hello, Mr. George. This is معك حسين بابا. أشكرك جزيلا وأنا سعيد وتشرفت بلقائك. سؤالي إني أفهم أن العنصرية موجودة في شتى بقاع العالم. في دولنا العربية توجد بين السنة والشيعة، في دول آسيوية كالهند وبورما توجد بين المسلمين والبوذ، حتى في أمريكا مقتل الشاب الأسود قبل فترة قليلة أثبتت أن العنصرية لا زالت موجودة وبنسب متفاوتة. لكن ما لا أفهمها أن في مجتمعات مثل بريطانيا وفرنسا والدول هذه أول الدول التي تبنت الحريات وادعتها، كيف لها أن لا تميز بين تصرف فردي وتصرف جماعي، وسيما أن لم يحدث 11 سبتمبر كما حدث في أمريكا حتى تكون هناك ردة فعل لشعب كامل. فما هي أسباب هذه العنصرية في هذه الدول؟
Undoubtedly, racism exists. The difference is, as you foreshadowed in your question, when Anders Breivik, the white Christian fascist in Norway, murdered 70 school children a few years ago in Norway, nobody dreamt of blaming all white people. Nobody dreamt of blaming all Christians. Nobody said that Christians should apologize for his actions. Nobody said white people were in any way collectively responsible for the actions of a man who was undoubtedly white, who said he was a Christian, who said he was a fascist, and massacred a lot of innocent school children. That kind of collective punishment, collective requirement, never happens. Now, Rupert Murdoch, the most powerful media baron on the earth, tweeted in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo affair that Muslims must be held responsible for what had been done in Paris until they had extirpated, cut out this element of fanaticism and extremism from their midst. In other words, 1.7 billion people must be held responsible. What does that mean? Trialed, prisoned, attacked, further hated. Now, when the most powerful media man in the world can say such a thing and compare and contrast it with the Breivik example I gave, or Bush and Blair killed 1 million people. Nobody's blaming all Americans, all white people, all British people, all Christians. Both of them had their Christianity on their sleeve, but nobody holds Christianity, Christ, responsible for the actions of Bush and Blair. And that's the key difference in this affair. Now, yes, sir, at the end.
Good afternoon. I just have a question on how we as a society can learn from this and how we can be better educated as to the limits on freedom of expression and how freedom of expression can be used as a means to be of service to society and humanity.
Well, in a way it's the big question, that one. And as I said earlier, the camel is difficult to define but easy to recognize. My right to swing my fist ends just before it makes contact with your jaw. Because I have a right to swing my fist, but I don't have the right to harm you. And I don't have the right to harm the rest of this society by what will happen next. Because if I hit you in the jaw, you'll hit me back, and there'll be a big fight, and there'll be a lot of trouble, and other people will be hurt. So that's the kind of philosophical point I'm trying to make. Of course, legitimate criticism of the actions of people must be preserved, must be defended, though it doesn't, of course, exist wholly for some people. I gave a speech in Leeds last summer calling for a boycott of all things Israeli. Not Jewish, all Israelis. And I was visited by the police and questioned under caution. Imagine. It's easy to stop my freedom of speech, or used to be, by just not letting me on the television, never quoting me in the newspapers. Because the newspapers and the televisions were owned by a small number of very rich and powerful people. Nowadays we have our own television, of course. So there are freedoms of speech for some people to make criticisms of the actions and the character and nature of people and institutions, but not so free for others. That's just an inequality, a difficulty that we're having to surmount ourselves. But I maintain that things which threaten social peace by deliberately scandalizing substantial numbers of people, by attacking in a wicked and obscene way that which is precious and sacred to them, should not be allowed. At least should be subject to legal challenge. It would be better, of course, if the ethics of the journalists and cartoonists could be relied upon. It would be better if the person paused with their pen and said, what am I actually doing here, and why am I doing it? But in the absence of ethics and honor amongst some professions, including the profession of politician, there should be legal restrictions against what they can do to harm others. Thanks very much. This has been Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, here in London on Mayadeen television.